today we'll just quickly touch upon what is actually being discussed in terms of transparency here at COP26. And transparency items are mainly hidden under an agenda item that's called methodological issues under the Paris Agreement. And there are 5 sub-items under here. And basically what they're doing here is that under the new transparency regime of the Paris Agreement, countries step into a common reporting system, which means same type of reporting for all countries regarding if you're a very developed country or a least developed country. In theory, there are common reporting requirements for all, although there are some caveats. The least developed country and the SIDS have extra flexibility to report at their discretion, and also for developing countries there is some flexibility. But exactly how this flexibility will be operationalized is being discussed here. And in particular, they're looking at a certain set of tables. So there are tables on reporting on greenhouse gas emissions. There is a table on reporting to track progress on the NDCs, so the targets that countries have set. There is a table for reporting on financial support provided and received and needed. And then there are also, then these are basically common tabular formats that countries submit. And these are annexed to a general biannual transparency report. And for this transparency report, they're also deciding on the outline for this report here. But then again, countries do not completely agree on whether this outline should be mandatory to use or voluntary, or maybe only mandatory for some countries and not for others. So that's discussions that are ongoing. And then once countries submit all these documents, they need to be reviewed by a technical expert team. And here in this session, they're also discussing what type of training and qualifications the experts would require to do this type of review. And then finally, there are also discussions here on the support that should be provided for doing all this reporting in the first instance. Now, it seems very technical because they're working on these long tables with different rows for different indicators to report on. But it's also a very political exercise because it kind of determines what elements will be made visible, what elements will be kind of highlighted very prominently in the reporting, and what elements will go in second tables. And something that's maybe particularly interesting and also one of the most contentious tables is the one on reporting on finance. Yesterday also the negotiations on this were closed off to observers at some point. And yeah, maybe Robert, you can say some more about why reporting on finance is so contentious.
Yeah, so reporting requirements for developed countries is especially of interest here because they have a significant number of reporting requirements that they have to fulfill on support provided and mobilized. So here, different countries interpret the reporting requirements in different ways. And that is much due to the fact that there is no international agreed upon definition of climate finance, nor is there an agreement upon whether climate finance should come in the form of loans or grants or both, and the equivalency between those. And therefore, countries have to provide information about their financial instruments. They have to provide information about the climate specificity of the funds provided. They have to provide information about whether they see this funding as being new and additional. And these elements, like I said already, are self-reported. So what we have seen from previous transparency arrangements under the UNFCCC is that 6 years of reporting has led to a number of different approaches to determining whether finance is being provided and how it's being mobilized. And on the developing country side, where countries are not require, but strongly encouraged to report on support received and support needed, we also see that there are many ways of reporting on this issue, because while developed countries are encouraged to be transparent about which methodologies they use to produce the information related to finance provided and mobilized, developing countries do not have to adhere to any particular methodology, nor do they have to describe their assumptions. So this is what is being tried to improve in the new Paris Enhanced Transparency Framework. However, with all of these definitional uncertainties also being present in the new regime, there is simply too strong of a disagreement between especially developed and developing countries on how these tables should look, who should be required to use them, and to what extent.
Yeah. I find it also very interesting when we were in one of these negotiations that they, for example, have a table and that then has different options for reporting. And for example, one thing was, for example, a developed country is supporting an adaptation project or some type of climate project in another country. Should it then report whether, it will have to say something about whether it's an adaptation or a mitigation project, but what if it's mainly a mitigation project with a small adaptation component? Should it then be called a mitigation project, or should it be called a cross-cutting project? Or should they have two columns that specify 10% mitigation, 90% adaptation? And it seems like developed countries rather have a very abstract approach where you just say cross-cutting, which makes it very difficult to get an overall picture of how much adaptation funding has been provided, right?
Yeah, and exactly the fact that adaptation is also really not being defined properly, or there's not at least an international agreed upon definition of what is adaptation, and therefore there's a lot of uncertainty around how developed countries classify adaptation projects.
So if I want to build a nice bridge and I include some elements to it that make it more resilient, it's an adaptation project.
It could be an adaptation project, perhaps.
Okay, so many infrastructure projects could be tagged as adaptation.
Potentially.
And does the same hold for climate specificity, that I can decide myself if this is a climate project or not?
Climate specificity is determined also by the countries doing the reporting. It is checked by the technical experts under the UNFCCC, but the UNFCCC experts cannot question how countries determine the climate specificity of their funding. They only rely on the fact that countries provide a definition that they have themselves come up with.
Yeah, but I still think it's going to be interesting, because under the new reporting regime, developed countries are going to report on the support they provided, but on the other side of the game, developing countries are going to report on the support they received. So you would expect that hopefully we'll see these two things kind of correspond in a way.
That is, so developed countries are very much in favor of these reporting mechanisms being kind of like a dialogue between developed and developing countries, because the developed countries are very interested in finding out what their funding is actually going towards. And this is also an element that developing countries see as, or some developing countries see as problematic, because some countries might feel that they don't have actual ownership over how the funds are being spent and to what purpose.
So I think there was also an idea kind of brought up in negotiations that the provider and the recipient of the funding should come to an agreement on what percentage of the project is climate specific, for example. But that may be quite difficult to implement in practice if it's going to.
yeah, then reporting might even take even longer.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And then I was also thinking this whole reporting on finance provided. Finance comes in different flavors, right?
It certainly does.
What type of flavors do we have here?
We have grants, which is very much favored by developing countries, and then we of course have loans, and there are different types of loans. We have concessional loans, and we have non-concessional loans. And concessional loans refers to loans that are significantly below market rate interest. And then you also have other financial instruments such as equity, where different portions of the finance can be, the ownership of the finance can be transferred to a different party, but that also involves some debt-based finance. And then you have what's less common but will potentially be more common in the future, the use of other debt-based financial instruments such as green bonds and climate bonds. And there is also the use of the clean development mechanism. So money produced through the carbon markets have also been at times transferred as climate finance.
Yeah, and of course it's quite difficult if countries report like we provided this amount of climate finance. Then I think I remember from the negotiations some developing countries mention we do not only want to talk about the quantity of funding, but also the quality of funding. And one tool that's being kind of brought up here is to do not only report kind of the face value of the money that's transferred through different flavors, but also the quality. So, or also kind of a metric that's called a grant equivalent.
Yeah, and that is especially controversial for developed countries, because some developed countries really do only provide climate finance in the form of loans, and a significant portion of their climate finance could be provided as loans, and that could be somewhat embarrassing or even seen as not a very politically promising development for the nature of climate finance, and having that reflected in transparency reports is maybe not what these countries would like.
Yeah, so that's a fight we've been seeing going on inside the negotiation rooms, where there's apparently countries agreed in Katowice a couple of years ago that there will be some type of reporting on grant equivalents, but exactly how it will be reflected in the tables is something that's being thought out now. For example, developing countries want to have a separate column that clearly states next to the face value also the grant equivalent. Developed countries are more hesitant to have this as a separate column and rather see it in a footnote or in a documentation box or somewhere hidden away in the table, so to say. And one particular item where developed countries do not seem to be very happy to report on grant equivalent is in support mobilized. Now, support mobilized is also a strange flavor, right? It's basically, it's not a grant, it's not a loan, but it seems to be more something where a country does some effort to facilitate private investment.
Yeah, and private investment very seldom involves grant-based financial support. This is supposed to be the attraction of private investors, obviously, where they are looking to support climate-related projects in developing countries, but they're also looking to make a profit by doing so. And therefore, very often, the use of loans and other debt-based financial instruments will be the dominant factor in this private finance mobilized climate finance.
Yeah, and so there is an interesting dynamic going on where the drafting of these reporting tables for finance and support, here the developing countries want to see more ambitious tables, so to say, but in the other rooms where they are discussing the tables for greenhouse gas inventories and tracking progress on the NDCs, this is where some large developing countries want to see clear caveats that they have in certain cases the liberty to delete certain rows or to not follow the outline, or to make sure the legal status of some of these tables is a voluntary one for developing countries, while at the same time trying to ensure no backsliding for developed countries, because many of these tables are based on a reporting scheme that used to apply for developed countries, but now that's going to apply for all. There is kind of a sense that for some countries it's too complex to do the whole thing. But then also countries do not want that developed countries are getting sort of a free ride where they go a step down in terms of their reporting. And so it seems there's kind of a difficult gridlock where countries are taking careful steps and finding creative ways to make movements forward, for example, by using clever wording, whether countries shall use a table or whether they should use a table or whether they are encouraged to use a table, and then in the table there should also be an annotation stating that it's not mandatory for developing countries, and then again in certain rows that there should be a footnote that for some developing countries or for developing countries this is not mandatory, and then developed countries come back and say, well, if we have one statement it's enough. But anyway, it seems like
like that, and this begs the question that we have grappled with during our time here. Will the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement actually be enhanced?
Yeah, and what do we mean with this question is basically, well, in certain ways it will present enhanced reporting requirements, definitely for developing countries who basically move from a system that was completely voluntary into a system where certain elements of reporting are mandatory, although there's some disagreement of how flexibility can be interpreted in doing so, whether flexibility applies across the board or whether it is something that applies to very specific elements. But there's also a risk that in kind of transferring the old system to this new common transparency system, the reporting for developed countries may, in certain instances, be a kind of a small step back.
Yeah.
And then reporting is only one side of the system, right? After you report information, there should be review of your information. And this is also a big question because there will be a technical review of the reports, but this technical review is very procedural. It checks if all the rows are properly filled out, if the methodologies are well applied. But it does not provide a judgment on whether a country has achieved its NDC, whether a country has done a fair share, whether it has mobilized enough support. All these kind of political judgments on the information are not part of the technical review in any way.
And that begs the question, will this transparency exercise lead to enhanced accountability in the global climate governance space?
But one has to know, the technical expert review is not the only review of information. So countries also engage in a sort of facilitative sharing of views session.
Yeah, which is an account-giving session, as it has been described by the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement, where one country presents its transparency report and the technical review of this transparency report in a multilateral forum where other countries can ask questions related to that specific report.
Yeah, and then the question is, of course, will countries dare to ask kind of political questions or kind of strong questions that interrogate whether a country has really put in enough effort to move ahead?
And how will countries respond to those questions?
Yeah, because as I'm even on the top of my head, but I think the deal was that questions are allowed, but countries are not required to provide a response. And also there are some caveats stating that this sharing of views should have a facilitative nature.
It is in the name, facilitative.
It is in the name. But the interesting thing is that for developing countries, this is basically a continuation of earlier arrangements. But developed countries used to have a somewhat more, slightly more strongly languaged type of account-giving process, right?
Yeah, a so-called multilateral assessment of the progress made by developed countries.
Yeah.
However, in the old regime, there was no scope included for asking questions related to climate finance.
Mm-hmm.
And that will be changed in the new regime, where this also falls under the scope of the facilitating sharing of views.
Yeah. So that would be an interesting enhanced type of format.
And it could be that then developing countries take the opportunity to ask more pointed questions related to climate finance, provided and mobilized.
Yeah. And also one thing that may be in this context interesting is the role of the compliance committee, right? Where
this is a new element.
It's a new element. There will be a Paris committee on compliance, but its function is not really clear yet. Whether there will be any kind of strong actions that can be taken if countries repeatedly fail to report or fail to engage.
Yeah, this will be negotiated by the countries themselves. So, it's only one's guess how this compliance committee will actually function in the new regime, but it is intended to be also a facilitative body where countries can ask for assistance both in terms of reporting and how they're being reviewed. And there's also an interesting element in this compliance committee that could open up for dealing with so-called systemic issues under the enhanced transparency framework. So the committee could potentially be a body that takes up the issue of, for instance, there not being an internationally agreed upon definition of climate finance, which in my research I would say is emblematic of a systemic issue that feeds into this entire reporting regime. So yes, it's very interesting, this new element.
Yeah, and then another ball game is, of course, like here they agree on the common reporting tables and everything, but then countries will at a domestic level need to start compiling the data, getting familiar with the tables, gathering and processing all this data into a format, and that requires substantial efforts and capacity to do so.
And the same goes for the subsequent review of these reports. We know that the current number of staff of technical reviewers have already overshot the capacity to provide a review of the reports in time. And in 5 years' time, we will have even more reporting and even more reviewing, where we might even not have enough technical reviewers to do all of the reviewing. And that begs the question, what will happen with the reporting then?
Yeah, and also this whole support for reporting is a contentious issue.
Absolutely.
There is now they're now scoping out a deal to kind of agree on what will be the amount of finance a developing country can apply for to write a report. So there will be support available in theory for the writing of a report. But developing countries have mentioned that sometimes this support is not enough to cover all the costs for writing a report. And also they are not satisfied with the fact that they have to apply every time again and again for a new finance to write a report.
No, and some countries, developing countries, have indicated that that could even distract from implementing real climate action, such as mitigation and adaptation projects,
Yeah.
which is very unfortunate because this is the foundation of reporting in the first place. It's supposed to lead to domestic climate action.
Yeah, yeah, and I know some proposals have been to, for example, be able to apply for 3 subsequent reports in a row, to have larger sums of capacity building support per term.
Yeah.
But yeah, ultimately we need to ask this question: is all this reporting also not at some point going to be a distraction at the domestic level? And in what ways will it actually support enhanced climate action? And in what ways will all the reports be taken up by other actors, and how will they be interrogated by other countries to reassess targets and policies?
All right.
Well,
that remains to be seen.
That remains to be seen. It was good to have this chat.
Yeah. I hope you enjoyed it, guys.
Yes.
Yeah, this is Robert and Max from COP26.